dark, cold night in February or something like this, hear a professor around all the time gas is something I'm very grateful for. And I see a lot of my friends here. I'm very thankful to be here. I hope that some of the people I don't know don't agree with me, because really I'd like to get that conversation. I would like to get that conversation started. So, that said, we start. Start with, I want to express the hope that the long record of civilly listening to and then acutely questioning a lecturer, which goes back long before I got here, some 35 years ago or so, will be maintained. This is inflammatory stuff, I know. And while I will do my best to be as honest and objective as possible, I am well aware that some of the things I say may outrage some of you, but then again, some of what some of you say outrages me. I also want to tell you that this talk can be sent to you or anyone you like, or anyone you like in written form, and that the factual assertions I make are pretty extensively footnoted, mostly to the internet, so it would be easy to check my sources. This summer, in Europe, the Israeli response to Hamas rocket attacks on their cities and the discovery of an elaborate complex of tunnels designed to facilitate terrorist attacks on Israeli villages planned for the Jewish New Year set off a vast wave of anti-Israel demonstrations. Many of them turned into open Jew-hating with calls of death to the Jews, and in some cases outright anti-Jewish violence, like the siege of a French synagogue. This was not a new story. The rise of outright Jew hatred in Europe in the wake of the ongoing attacks on Israel by what I will call the international progressive movement has been noticeable for years. At Kenyon, the issue was raised recently in a much milder form with the savage tweets of Professor Steven Salaita, which cost him the job he'd been offered at the University of Illinois, were variously described as outright anti-Semitic by some and defended as merely anti-Zionist by others. Fears were expressed on campus that anyone who supported the boycott of Israel, BDS, or the one-state solution, meaning the destruction of the state of Israel and its replacement by an Arab-majority state, would be labeled ipso facto an anti-Semite. It is useful, therefore, it seems to me, to try to see what distinction, if any, can be made between anti-Zionism and bigotry against Jews. I will try to reserve the term anti-Semite for a particular kind of Jew hatred, one that was dominant for about 100 years between 1850 and 1950, but which has now been replaced by more contemporary forms. By anti-Zionist, I don't mean people who are critical of the policies of the government of Israel, what Israeli isn't, but people who either openly admit to wanting to destroy Israel or who seek to delegitimize it, i.e. contend that it has no right to exist. That, of course, is the real content of the absurd charge that Israel is an apartheid state. So I will use the general term Jew hatred for bigotry against Jews. First, I want to show how it is that to many Jews it seems impossible to distinguish between anti-Zionism and Jew hatred. Second, I will try to show how, despite appearances, anti-Zionism doesn't have to be Jew hatred. Third, I will argue that despite the theoretical differences, the two tend to converge for many reasons. Thus, fourth and last, I will make some suggestions about what anti-Zionists who really aren't covert Jew haters could do, beyond simply assert their innocence in order to make the differences more evident. First part, anti-Zionism looks like Jew hatred. There are more reasons than I can list here why to many what excuses itself as merely anti-Zionism is unmistakable Jew hatred. Israel is a country founded on the basis of international law out of the League of Nations mandate through a vote by the United Nations General Assembly. It is a country which has existed since 1948 in a state of war with its neighbors, who have, with the exception of Egypt in 1979 and Jordan in 1994, never made peace with her. The UN voted partition of the remaining Palestine mandate. Part had already been severed to create the Kingdom of Transjordan, but the Arabs indignantly refused a Palestinian state. The so-called Palestinian refugee problem is a deliberate product of Arab policy. The revanchist Arab nations refused to resettle them in Arab countries, after failing to destroy Israel in 1948, just so they could be kept on the West Bank and in Gaza as a festering sore and as a tool both of propaganda and military force against the existence of Israel. An almost equal number of Jewish refugees from Arab countries in 1948 and thereafter were of course absorbed into Israel without much fuss. BDS, the contemporary movement to boycott Israel, is in fact nothing more than a continuation of the Arab League boycott established in 1948, and the one-state solution is nothing but the continuation of the Arab war against the existence of the Jewish state. If one is an Arab, it's understandable, perhaps, that one has never reconciled oneself to a Jewish state in the Middle East, though the refusal to recognize Israel's reality has been patently self-destructive as well. But if one isn't an Arab, what explains the wish, the animus, and the wish to destroy Israel among Westerners? Why is the Jewish state the only one that has no right to exist? Does this have nothing to do with its being Jewish? Really? That's hard to believe. Then, too, the campaign against Israel is hard to understand for many other reasons. Anti-Zionists are very big on advertising their own compassion. The sufferings of the Gazans occupy them greatly. These are the people who, when Israel turned Gaza over to them, elected a government which is pledged to genocide against Jews, not just Zionists, but Israelis, and has done its level best to turn theory into practice with whatever rockets they could smuggle through the Israeli blockade and by building those murder tunnels that the Israeli ground incursion was meant to destroy. Well, okay, our anti-Zionists are full of compassion anyway. But why, one asks oneself, doesn't that reveal itself in any publicized concern for the slaughter of nearly 200,000 and counting Syrians and the immiseration of millions of others? Why do we hear nothing from them about the slaughter of Iraqi Christians and Yazidis? Where's that compassion when we need it? Why don't we have petitions against Al-Qaeda or ISIS coming from these folks? There's a lot more going on in the region that compassionate people could become indignant about. Somehow, it's always the Jews. Even with Gaza, there is something very strange about the anti-Zionists' perspective. They constantly write about the evils of the Israeli blockade, one that was imposed at first to persuade the Gazans to moderate their genocidal policies, and then when it was loosened significantly in 2009 to keep Hamas from getting what it needed to kill Israelis. But since the Muslim Brotherhood government was overthrown in Egypt, the Egyptian government, knowing Hamas to be an offshoot of the Brotherhood, has been imposing an even harsher blockade on the Sinai side. One of the chief demands of Hamas in the latest round was an end to the Egyptian blockade. Has anyone gotten up an international campaign against this? I don't think so. Interesting. Then, too, it is hard to understand why, of all the national liberation movements, the only one that progressives hate is the Jewish one. These are the people, after all, who oppose, they say, colonialism, racism, and oppression in all forms. There isn't another national liberation movement in the world, from South Africa to Vietnam, they have not defended passionately. Not only do they deny the Jewish people alone the right of national self-determination, they also seem to have little problem in supporting openly racist and oppressive political movements. They will excuse Hamas by every verbal trick in the book, and we've got some nice Salaita quotes there, but condemn those Hamas who sworn to murder. It's hard not to wonder why. Anti-Zionists sometimes explain that they only pick on Israel because it's an ally of the United States, unless a bully. You might want to go on YouTube for Dylan's song, The Neighborhood Bully. They and much of the left-leaning world media were full of indignation about disproportionate civilian casualties in Gaza this summer. Of course, these were the product of Hamas's openly stated policy of making martyrs out of civilians. Hamas fighters and commanders themselves, against the laws of war, hid their own heroic selves among civilians and planted their rocket batteries in mosques and schools, apparently with the connivance of UN officials. Israel went after those sites because they were raining about 3,000 rockets or so, no longer just on towns like Sderot near the border, but all over Israel, including the big cities. But today, when the United States is undertaking a campaign of bombing in Iraq and Syria against ISIS, one might expect to hear great concern for civilian casualties there. So far, not much. And as for Israel being an ally of the United States, the last few years have surely called that into question for all but the very naive. For instance, the sharp criticism of Israel for causing civilian casualties in Gaza by an administration which, in order to bomb ISIS, has loosened its own strictures against civilian casualties. And then there is, not to mention the chicken shit fiasco, the strange business of the State Department condemning American citizens who fight for Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but condoling with the family of a Palestinian-American terrorist who was shot while trying to throw a Molotov cocktail at Jewish motorists while it refused to condemn him for his act. And of course, there is the latest round of nonsense, where the Obama administration pretended it hadn't been notified that Prime Minister Netanyahu had been invited by Speaker Boehner and went into a large huff about this alleged breach of protocol. All this at the same time that the administration is carrying out its long-term plan of rapprochement with Iran, a nation that openly speaks of destroying Israel and gloats about it being a one-bomb country. There's an article by Michael Doran on Obama's secret Iran strategy, which gives you the facts. In short, some ally. Then there is the closely related piety that, while indeed the Palestinians aren't perfect, the overwhelming power advantage Israel has makes it incumbent on Israel to change to reach the exacting standards that its critics have for it, and on the critics to focus their ire on Israel. The feebleness of this excuse or bias is almost patent, but it is perhaps worth pointing out that the anti-Zionists who argue this have to keep their focus very, very narrow, even to believe what they are saying. Turkey and Iran, the two great regional powers, are run by blatantly Jew-hating governments, and Iran openly calls for the elimination of the Jewish state. Aside from the cold peace with Egypt and the so-so peace with Jordan, Israel is surrounded by much more populous nations, one of which is soon likely to have nuclear weapons, which hate it and have never denied wanting to destroy it. Iran smuggles rockets and war materials to Hamas, and its troops, mingled with its Hezbollah clients, are currently on Israel's northern border. How can anyone, one asks oneself, take such an absurdity seriously? Surely it's just an excuse to justify hatred of Jews in particular. Anti-Zionists also often say that Israel is a settler state and thus a relic of colonialism. I don't know how many Americans who say this are full-blooded Native Americans, but probably not all that many, I suspect. Guess what? We're a settler state too. Why not start at home if you have a big problem with that? You might start by taking down the Statue of Liberty and the politically incorrect poem by Emma Lazarus at the statue's base, which contains the famous lines, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore." As it happens, Professor Salaita is consistent on this point, so he tweets, "Dear outraged right-wingers, you should know that in addition to opposing Zionism, I fully support the decolonization of North America." Thus, practically all of those who gave him a standing ovation should start packing for Europe, Asia, and Africa before they say or do anything else against Israel. In fact, so should he. What, by his logic, is he but another colonialist who should go back home to Jordan or the West Bank? Somehow, though, again, it's a principle that only seems to apply to the Jews. And why could that be? But of course, the charge of colonialism against Israel is, given the historical realities, almost an obscenity. Who are these settlers but the remnants of European Jewry, people who were caught in the Nazi dragnet, often because no place else, including mandatory Palestine and the United States of America, would take them? And of course, they are also the descendants of those Jews expelled from Arab countries in 1948, not to mention the Jews of the USSR who fled the persecution of communist Jew hatred, nor the despised Ethiopian falashas who were accepted as Jews in Israel and who make the streets of an Israeli city look more diverse in the contemporary meaning than many American cities. And now the French and the other European Jews who are currently fleeing physical, violent Jew hatred and who come to Israel for refuge will leave Israel as victims, will leave Europe as victims, but arrive in Israel as imperialist exploiters. Some settlers, some colonialists. In fact, to be serious, what country can claim to represent pure autochthony, its population completely undescended from conquerors? The history of Israel is instructive. Fought over by Egyptians, Hittites, and Canaanites, it was conquered by the Hebrews, taken away from them by Assyrians and Babylonians, who lost it to the Persians, who allowed the Jews to return, who in turn, having rebuilt the temple, were then conquered by the Greeks, who passed it on to the Hellenistic Syrians who were defeated by a Jewish rebellion which created a third Jewish state, which was then conquered by Rome, which evolved into Byzantium, which was conquered by the Arabs, who were, leaving out the rather lengthy episode of the Crusades, conquered by the Turks, who were conquered by the British, who created a Palestine mandate under the aegis of the League of Nations, to be a Jewish nation, to be a Jewish homeland, but without doing anything, quote, which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Wow. That mandate saw a lot of Arab immigration, especially from Egypt. Those great Palestinian heroes, Edward Said and Yasser Arafat, were at least as much Egyptians as Palestinians. So who are the natives? Who are the settlers? Thus once more applying one set of rules to everyone else and another one, and a very crazy one at that, to the Jewish state sure seems like bigotry on the face of it. Then too, anti-Zionists ignore everything Israel does to make peace and excuse every Arab refusal. Up until 2000, one might possibly think that Israel was being recalcitrant about giving the Palestinian Arabs their rights as a nation. Since 2000, no one can honestly claim that. But the anti-Zionists still do. After the offer made by the Social Democratic Barak government of Gaza and almost all the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, which no one had expected the Israelis to offer for a Palestinian state, it was dismissed by a number of excuses, none of them sensible, much less valid. For the facts, consult the book about the negotiations written by the American negotiator Dennis Ross, The Missing Piece, Piece. The similar offers of the centrist Olmert government and the center-right Netanyahu government usually don't even get mentioned. Somehow, Israel remains responsible for the occupation of territory she can't give back in return for a simple peace treaty and recognition of what she is, the Jewish national home. Israeli withdrawal from South Lebanon, which earned it a war with Hezbollah, complete with serious rocket assaults on northern Israel, or its withdrawal from Gaza, which has earned it several conflicts with Hamas, aren't even acknowledged, and the lie is told by anti-Zionists that Israel is still somehow occupying Gaza. Can anyone imagine that Israel would allow Hamas to rule in an area it actually occupied? In fact, Israel, at great cost, no little danger, and no benefit whatever to itself, maintains border crossings with Gaza so that Gazan farmers can truck their produce to Jordan and Saudi Arabia without having the costs of shipping it around the peninsula by boat. I saw the bullet holes in the masonry of the Keren Shalom crossing where Arab terrorists had hidden in a cargo truck to avert a shooting. Anyone ever hear of that crossing before? If so, from an anti-Zionist? Other examples are almost too grotesque to be believed, and yet they don't seem to involve calculation so much as internalized hatred which comes out as automatic conditioned reflex. For instance, a Palestinian terrorist drives into a crowd in Jerusalem, injuring 8, one of whom died later, and also killing a baby girl who it turns out was an American citizen. He is shot when he makes a run for it. The AP headline? Anybody want to guess? Of course, Israel shoots man in East Jerusalem. Similarly, the New York Times headline for a story about a Palestinian-American teenager who was shot trying to throw a Molotov cocktail at passing Jewish motorists. Israeli troops kill Palestinian teenager. What else could one expect? And what could explain this sort of dishonesty except pure malice? And what could the grounds of that malice be other than the ancient, all too familiar one? Or so it seems. Then there is that beautiful one-state solution in which, so they say, a Jewish minority will be able to live happily, side by side with an Arab majority. This is such obvious nonsense that it is hard to believe that those who say it mean it as anything but a cover for the likely genocide that would in fact result from the destruction of Israel. Anyone who knows anything about the Arab world knows how Jew hatred, partly of Quranic origin and in large part a matter of imported European anti-Semitism in the strict sense, dominates the Arab world. Here, in addition to the internet links I cite, I suggest reading Paul Berman's book, Flight of the Intellectuals. Even in the best case, outlined by Ali Abu Nima of the Electronic Intifada, Jews will be a tolerated minority in the new majority Arab state and will have no separate identity except as citizens who happen to be Jews. While this peaceful vision is either a foolish or a dishonest fantasy of what the reality would be, and the Palestinian Authority is scarcely better in this respect than Hamas, as a New York jury just pointed out yesterday, even if it came to pass, the BDS one-state movement would have succeeded in returning the Jewish people around the world to the precise position they were in 1939. Is it any wonder that most Jews say thanks but no thanks to such a generous offer? Finally, there is the nasty trick of blaming the rise of Jew hatred not on the Jew haters, but on the Jews. Thus, the Episcopal chaplain at Yale blamed Israel's failure to make peace with her sworn enemies as the cause of anti-Semitism. Professor Salaita, for instance, has tweeted that Israel has changed anti-Semitism from a disgrace to something honorable. That is a very familiar charge to Jews. If people hate them, they have been told for millennia it is their own fault. Just in the news, research in the Black Notebooks of the late great philosopher and Nazi Martin Heidegger arguing that yes, the Jews brought on their own extermination. Of course. And also, hot off the internet and Swedish national radio, the aptly named journalist Helena Groll asked the Israeli ambassador if Jews weren't to blame for anti-Semitism. True, she should have said Zionists, but it's the same bad old story. Once one surveys the partiality, the deliberate ignorance, the unfairness, the absurdity of many of the charges that anti-Zionists typically make, and the reasons they give for those charges, it becomes difficult for many of us not to conclude simply that this is Jew hatred masked as something else. After all, Jew hatred historically has had many forms. For the Romans, it was a sense that the Jews were sinister and alien. For the Christians, of course, Jews were the hated Christ killers. For the 19th century anti-Semites, it had nothing whatever to do with religion, you see. It was just that the Jews belonged to a different race, which didn't mix well with Aryans. Thus, they should best go back to the Middle East, where they come from. Here is, for example, a famous quotation from Marx's rival Proudhon. The Jew is the enemy of mankind. It is necessary to send this race back to Asia or exterminate it. By fire or fusion or by expulsion, the Jew must disappear. To Marxists, of course, Judaism was a reactionary superstition like all the others, and Jewish Marxists tended to reveal their Jewish chauvinism, as they do today, by negation, by a special hatred of the Jewish religion or Jewish nationalism. In other words, Jews are used to all kinds of reasons for hating them. And when those reasons make as little sense as those offered by contemporary anti-Zionists, it's a pretty reasonable bet that what's lurking underneath is the old rishis, as Jews used to call it, which meant blind hatred of Jews. One of the earmarks of a lot of anti-Semitism that persuades observers that it is really Jew hatred is the vehemence of the rhetoric. And interestingly, the more vehement the rhetoric, the more likely it is to express itself in traditionally Jew-hating ways. Thus, in Britain, one cartoon that won a prize as the best of the year showed former Prime Minister Sharon eating Palestinian children. Then the left-wing New Statesman published a cover in 2002 showing the Union Jack impaled on the point of a very large and threatening Star of David. This is again the old and ugly charge about Jewish disloyalty and the threat the Jews present to the nations they live in. It's worth pointing out that the Star of David in the picture is not taken from the Israeli flag, it's just the universal Jewish symbol. Then there is the noxious and all too frequent use of the Israel is Nazis meme, a claim originating in Soviet propaganda, now made by anti-Zionists to benefit Hamas, of all people. It seems a dead giveaway to the motives of those who use it. If the Jews, qua Israelis, are Nazis, then what were the Nazis? Just people who tried proactively to kill people just like them? Here I would like to quote the distinguished British novelist and Jew, Howard Jacobson. He writes recently about that indurated, unremitting hostility to Israel that tries to pass itself off as a disinterested critique of Zionism, but whose slip increasingly is showing. Specifically, those attacks upon the very legitimacy and founding principles of Israel, that rhetoric of blame that inculpates the Israeli government and army at every turn, now accusing them of massacre, now of genocide, comparing them to the Nazis in Gaza, the Warsaw Ghetto, that assumption of willful sadism, of wallowing in slaughter, no matter that there is no evidence to support the charge or a motive to explain it. In short, that implicit invocation, in other words, of the ancient figure of the Jew as malign being, pitiless adversary, and of course, child killer, Salaita's tweet about Netanyahu with children's teeth as a necklace. He concludes that this is fair criticism, under no circumstances to be confused with anti-Semitism, is belied not only by the extremity of its language, but by the ill will implicit in its system of comparison. I would suggest understanding Professor Salaita's notorious tweet after the kidnapping of the 3 teenagers on the West Bank that, while you may be too refined to say it, but I'm not, I wish all the F-word West Bank settlers would go missing in that context. And of course in the context of the delight the Palestinian media showed about the kidnapping. As always, it celebrates and glorifies every act of murder and terror against Israel. As Jacobson says, the last century teaches that extremity can pass from refined discourse to street barbarism in no time at all. And if the mob detects the sweet cordite-like smell of anti-Semitism in your prose, that's because it's there. Second part, anti-Zionism as progressivism. Still, appearances can be deceptive. And there is another explanation of the sources of all this Israel hatred that is compatible with it not being Jew hatred. To understand it, we need some more brief historical background. Religions in their popular form, and I believe this is true of all three revealed religions and popular Buddhism and Hinduism as well, boil down the sophisticated teachings of their adepts into a simple binary. The saved and the damned, the good and the evil, the sheep and the goats, the angels and the devils. Most people are at heart, it appears, Manichaeans. Modern secularism, however, in no way changed this tendency. Starting with the French Revolution, where a simple binary operated between the people and the aristocrats, then was updated by the Marxists into the binary of proletarians and capitalists, and when the realities of Marxist regimes finally got through to all but the most fanatical and obtuse, the radical left, like the radical right, with its binary of Aryans and Jews and communists, could not give up seeing the world in the simple terms of good guys and bad guys. Only this time, from the 1960s on, it was the simple binary of the rich, developed colonialist nations against the poor, downtrodden, colonized, marginalized nations. One has to face it. Progressivism is a very simple and indeed simple-minded religion. True, it doesn't worship a transcendent God, but it does worship a God. As far as I can tell, the God of progressivism is the idealized moral self of the worshiper, him or herself. For years now, progressivism has seemed to me to be narcissism with a priestly face. Thus, indignation at the reprobates pays double in psychic coin. Indignation always feels good, since one becomes someone different from one's normal, everyday, inadequate, awkward self, and gets to unite with avenging justice and goodness. Thus one becomes strong and invulnerable, like Eeyore, one isn't asking anyone, but telling everyone. But in progressivism, where there is no perfect transcendent God to hold you accountable, and before whom you must always be humble, one gets the pleasures of indignation pure, uncut. Indeed, one becomes a God oneself. Keeping this in mind, it becomes possible to explain the otherwise inexplicable progressive hatred of Israel. Israel, in fact, originally represented a real problem for the left. Israel was created in large part because the Soviet Union, putting a finger in the eye of British imperialism, had its bloc vote for partition. Israel was also run for many years by a European socialist elite that made it hard for the non-communist left to disown them. But after the 1967 war, when Israel responded to the Egyptian-Syrian mobilization and the dismissal of UN troops from the Sinai buffer zone, and when it conquered the Sinai, the West Bank, Jordan joined the war even though Israel had begged it to stay out, in the Golan Heights, a big meeting of the new left took place in this country. It made the fateful decision, following the Soviet line, by the way, that from now on Israel was to be considered as one of the bad guys, a colonial state, an outpost of American imperialism. It has taken quite a while for this view to become leftist orthodoxy, and there are still liberals who are queasy about it, but it's come in like a very slow-moving tide, powerful one, and now it rules among progressives all over the world. So, do anti-Zionists ignore facts and complicate their simple picture? Of course. Do they unquestioningly assert untruths that they have read in propaganda sheets as true? Of course. Do they denounce in the most strident terms without any humanity or moderation? Of course. Do they ignore catastrophes where the stipulated good guys are slaughtering each other and focus only on the Jewish state? Of course. Do they caricature, vilify, and excuse, or even encourage violence? Of course. Do they offer ridiculous, reassuring scenarios of what the destruction of Israel would lead to? Of course. And do they unconditionally support the side in the conflict that refuses to share the land or compromise, but insists on having everything its own way without regard to either the claims or the mere fact of the 6 million Jews who live there? Of course! This is exactly what their leftist predecessors did for most of the 20th century when it came to the Soviet Union. They cheerfully condoned in the US behavior like the show trials, while rallying indignantly against the trial of the Scottsboro Boys in America. They notoriously turned on a dime about World War II, which had been a capitalist war that should be opposed tooth and nail, and instantly became a holy cause when Hitler invaded the motherland of socialism, the USSR. Anyone who knows the history of the left in the 20th century could multiply these examples by the hundreds. Unfairness, one-sidedness, even conscious dishonesty are all justified for the sake of the cause of revolution or rectification of historical wrongs or whatever it is. For such people, those Eric Hoffer called true believers, the old saying that comes out of the Catholic Church, error has no rights, is a simple guide to action. Therefore, when Israel gets the same treatment, it doesn't mean that it's because of Jew hatred. It might, and in many cases surely is, just the usual run-of-the-mill, foolish, unfair, simple-minded, superstitious, utopian, and intellectually unscrupulous behavior of yet another historically evolved popular religious cult. In addition, once you pick your side in such a simple binary, it's not just that any stick becomes good enough to beat your evil enemy. It even becomes virtually impossible to see the world from any other angle than your own. Where, for example, a Zionist as fervidly nationalistic as Zev Jabotinsky could understand perfectly well the reasons why Arabs utterly rejected any compromise with Zionism, and thus saw the world far more realistically than his more pious leftist rivals, the progressive true believer, by and large, can't even do that. Every contradiction of one's views is dismissed as based on false evidence, as too trivial to worry about, or an unfortunate fact that the ultimate outcome of the just cause cancels. Furthermore, they have an excuse. How can they be Jew haters if prominent among them are Jews? And indeed they are. Some leading anti-Zionists are not only Jews, but Israelis. Some of the worst falsehoods about Israel have been perpetrated by them. For instance, there was the notorious Tantura massacre, where allegedly Jews murdered 250 Arabs in 1948, and which turns out not to have happened, as the revisionist historian Benny Morris utterly convincingly demonstrates. The famous case of the little Egyptian boy, Mohammed al-Dura, who was allegedly shot by Israelis in Gaza in a crossfire, incited worldwide indignation against Israel. It was filmed by an Arab cameraman who sent it to a French progressive Jewish newsman, who immediately broadcast to the world this evidence of Israeli perfidy and cruelty. It has been demonstrated repeatedly that there was no way that Israeli fire could have been responsible. The whole event, in fact, seems to have been staged. Go to YouTube and see for yourself. What is going on with Jewish anti-Zionism is a Jewish thing, hard to explain to non-Jews. Suffice it that when the ghettos were opened in the 19th century and assimilation became possible, different Jews had different responses. Some stayed Orthodox, others assimilated partly or wholly, and still others found the essence of true Judaism in the progressive, usually Marxist, cause of bringing on the Messianic age through revolution. For them, Zionism as the expression of retrograde Jewish nationalism was simply the devil, and as I said, their Jewish chauvinism, still alive even in negation, expressed and continues to express itself in a particular hatred of Zionism. They are not, as some accuse them of being self-hating Jews. That phenomenon exists, but not here. As far as I can tell, these folks admire themselves in the best progressive way. In many cases, they even feel that theirs is the true Jewish heritage. Jews generally understand how this works. For non-Jews, however, it has a very different and powerful effect. If they say it about themselves, it must be true. So how can any of it be Jewish? Credulity in this situation is relatively excusable. Those who don't follow things closely can't be expected to know how far Jewish anti-Zionists would go to malign Israel. Thus, there are reasons why one might be anti-Zionist without being a Jew hater. In general, it seems to me one ought not to assume that the one implies the other, but should wait for very clear indications. Still, the mere assertion that one is only an anti-Zionist and not a Jew hater is not sufficient for credibility. Sometimes anti-Zionism is at best an excuse for real Jew hatred, and other times Jew hatred creeps in to the feelings, ideas, expressions, and finally opinions of someone who just originally was just an anti-Zionist. The two tend to converge in all kinds of ways that make it often hard to tell the difference and pose great dangers for those who want to be progressive, but not Jew haters. When anti-Zionism clearly masks Jew hatred. I will limit myself to one clear example. The British medical journal Lancet has, under the editorship of Dr. Richard Wharton, made a point of attacking Israel. Recently, it published an open letter by 5 doctors, which was extremely hostile to Israel. The authors all said they had no outside connections to the issue. In fact, at least 2 of them are anti-Zionist activists connected with Palestinian NGOs. It then turned out, the Daily Telegraph reported that they had sent out to their circle a video of the notorious American neo-Nazi and former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, David Duke, ranting about the Jewish control of banks, politics, and media, along with an enthusiastic endorsement. Not surprisingly, one of them claims that she's not anti-Semitic, she just is legitimately using her freedom of opinion. One of her opinions is that Jews were responsible for the Boston Marathon bombing. This report will tell you a lot about the problem in, to use the term advisedly, a nutshell. When anti-Zionism and Jew hatred obviously merge. First are the really obvious examples, where the claim of anti-Zionism is the thinnest veil for straight Jew hate. Thus Pomiat, a grossly Jew-hating outfit in Russia in the 1990s, which called for Jews to be excluded from higher education and government, still claimed it was only anti-Zionist. And then there's the famous French comedian, Dieudonné, by the way, not a Muslim, who has joined with the notorious Holocaust denier, Robert Faurisson, and whose Canel salute, a redirected Heil Hitler gesture, has become the recognition sign of European Jew haters who love to have themselves photographed outside Auschwitz or Holocaust memorials giving it. And who has recently been arrested for his Je suis Charlie Koulibaly tweet, expressing solidarity with the murderer of 4 Jews at a kosher market in Paris. Excuse me, the perpetrator of an act of random violence which killed some folks. And who also says he's just an anti-Zionist. The fact that progressives flock to his defense as merely anti-establishment and anti-colonialist is another reason why some wonder if there's any difference at all between anti-Zionism and Jew hate. Here are 2 cases which are only slightly less obvious and which differ a bit but instructively. The first involves a rant by that proud member of BDS and Pink Floyd, Roger Waters. Waters' attack is ostensibly directed against Israel, but extends to the right-wing rabbinate, which is so bizarre. They believe that everybody that is not a Jew is only on earth to serve them, and the indigenous people of the region that they kicked off the land in 1948 are subhuman. The parallels with what went on in the 30s in Germany are so crushingly obvious. This is anti-Zionist, obviously enough, but who has the gall to deny that asserting that rabbis see non-Jews as slaves and subhuman and they are identical to the Nazis is classic Jew-hating stuff? It's pretty clear that Waters has been deeply affected by the Jew-hating virus. Sure, it's just right-wing rabbis he says he's on about, but the picture ought to be clear enough to anyone who isn't blinded by partisan fervor. The second case involves anti-Zionists who may in fact not be Jew-haters, but who end up in bed with them. The Presbyterian Church just this year voted to boycott Israel, hard. This led the aforementioned David Duke to a fit of jubilation. Above all, he was thrilled that the church had published a document which adopted his term of Jewish supremacy to describe Zionism. To its credit, the Presbyterian Church did not give its canonical approval to that doctrine, but it's out there with the church's name on it. Having the foremost American racists cheering you on ought, one would think, to give progressive anti-Zionists at least some cause to wonder about what they are doing, but so far, no such luck. When anti-Zionism and Jew hatred less obviously merge, there are other, subtler forces moving anti-Zionism and Jew hatred into lockstep. One is simply that the one-sided Israel bashing the progressive anti-Zionists engage in tends to make those who are exposed to it, or perhaps lack the subtlety of the progressive conscience, into outright Jew haters. Thus, in Britain, a disturbing survey revealed that 45% of the population apparently harbors anti-Semitic sentiments to some degree, and that 82% of British Jews believe that it's the product in part of anti-Israel coverage in the media. And all-party parliamentary inquiry into anti-Semitism agrees, singling out the BBC for blame. The second tendency was illustrated by the unfortunate BBC correspondent Tom Wilcox, who, interviewing an elderly French Jewish woman after the kosher market murders, which accompanied the Charlie Hebdo killings, elicited her assertion in labored English that Jews had become targets. Wilcox thereupon weighed in with a sanctimonious observation that some people thought the Palestinians had suffered greatly from the Israelis. Confronted by a storm of outrage and by charges of having sent the BBC to a new low, Wilcox apologized for having involuntarily given offense by a poorly phrased question. What seems to have happened is that as a good progressive focused on the Israel-Palestine issue, it was second nature, a matter of course for Wilcox to interpret straight Jew hatred, why select Jews to murder as a protest against the bombing of ISIS, as being about Zionism. Paradoxically, it was Wilcox's high-minded progressivism that seemed to have led him, against his own will, I believe, in effect, to blur the line between anti-Zionism and Jew hatred. Anti-Zionism and Jew hatred tend to join. There are thus evidently powerful forces which tend to link anti-Zionism to Jew hatred. The truth of this has been demonstrated empirically in a study in the Journal of Conflict Resolution by Edward H. Kaplan and Charles A. Small. But how could it happen that progressives and neo-Nazis end up saying the same things? The causes need to be explored. The first is perhaps the hardest to explicate clearly. The history of Jew hatred is a long one, and over the centuries it has accumulated certain stereotypes and images that even among people who would never think of themselves as anti-Semites come up, as it were, out of the collective unconscious when they get angry. This is probably what explains why so much of European anti-Israel imagery especially calls on classic Jew-hating references. Both the Sharon cartoon and the New Statesman cover are good examples of this. But it has to be said there's a real problem with Jews that cannot be airbrushed. Jews are a religion and they are a people. And to the extent they are both, to many people something weird and uncanny seems to be going on. Somehow in 19th century Europe, Jews who converted were still suspect, sometimes even more so. Either way, the Jews can lose. Take, for example, Professor Salaita's defense against the charge of anti-Semitism. According to him, Israel is a state, and nothing he says about either its citizens or anybody who defends a state is anti-Semitism, because he says he only cares about a state. That it is a Jewish state, that it exists for the protection of the Jewish people against those who hate them. That Jews care, and indeed need to care about the fate of other Jews, is simply ignored. Jews are a religion and have no claims as a people, so he's no anti-Semite, just an anti-Zionist. And however hatefully he expresses himself, there's nothing for Jews as Jews to worry about. Not exactly subtle as sophistry goes, but apparently effective. More benignly, during the Bush years, when the rhetoric of the anti-war movement got really bitter, as mainstream a figure as Democratic Senator from South Carolina, Ernest Hollings, a very decent guy, could claim that it had been caused by Jews in the administration who were trying to protect Israel by invading Iraq. In fact, Israel's main concern then and now was Iran. Were Hollings and the many leftists and rightists like Pat Buchanan, who echoed this Jew haters, just because they were sounding that old nefarious charge of dual loyalty that Jew haters from Tacitus on have made? I don't think there's a clear-cut answer. Again, Jew hatred can be understood in a certain way as a disease. It creeps up on the often unsuspecting victim who may be dominated by real dislike of Jews long before he or she would admit openly to hating Jews. It does so in the form of calling up when angry those old images and stereotypes and using them half, but only half innocently to express how one feels. Here's a typical example. Sabine Wölfle, a German social democratic politician, is passionately pro-Palestinian. She had, for instance, denounced Claude Lanzmann's film Israel Why because it didn't present the Palestinian view. She made the news, however, for putting out on Facebook a, quote, crude anti-Semitic conspiracy video, unquote, about how the Jewish banking Rothschild family controls the finances of London and the media on behalf of the Jews. It claims that the Rothschilds are responsible for the murders of millions. The Rothschilds were in fact the bugaboo of 19th and 20th century anti-Semites. The Nazis made their own Rothschild film in 1940, which ended rather like the New Statesman cover with a Star of David menacing the world. Ms. Wölfle, an office holder in the parliament of the German state of Baden-Württemberg, explained that she is not an anti-Semite and was only interested in the criticism of the financial sectors, not in the fact that the Rothschilds were Jewish. She only realized later on, she said, that the video was anti-Semitic. Is that likely?